Welcome back to Almost Nowhere, the podcast where we explore what's next for insurance and how to get there from here. I'm Alicia Burke from the CES Institute.
And I'm Max Martinelli from Accurate. Today we're heading into the fire, literally and figuratively, as we explore the growing risks and data gaps in wildfire planning and land use.
As we record this, wildfire season is well underway in Florida, and the stories we're seeing aren't isolated. From California to Colorado to the Carolinas, the data shows a steady rise in both the frequency and the severity of wildfires. According to a 2025 white paper from KCC, the average number of large wildfires has more than doubled since 1985. Insurers are facing a new level of complexity in modeling risk, not just in the West, but nationwide.
What's striking is the atmospheric angle. The report emphasizes that most catastrophic wildfire losses are driven by predictable weather events, like Santa Ana or Diablo winds, not random accidents. It's not a question of if, but where and when. That makes planning, data, and modeling not just useful, but essential.
We've seen the headlines. Wildfire seasons are getting longer, hotter, and harder to predict. But what's less visible is just how disconnected the wildfire response landscape still is between insurers, planners, data modelers, and communities on the ground.
At the recent Casualty Actuarial Society 2025 RPM conference, there was a presentation from Milliman Consultants that discussed that wildfire isn't just a climate problem, it's a coordination problem. As one report said, there are many uncoordinated stakeholders, resulting in significant disconnects between who is exposed, who understands the risk, and who can act. That gap is where this episode lives.
And that's where today's guest comes in, someone who spent the last 15 years at the intersection of wildfire risk, community development, and resilience.
Our guest today is Molly Mowery, a national leader in wildfire mitigation and land use planning. She's the founder of the Wildfire Planning International and co-founder of the Community Wildfire Planning Center, where she spent more than 15 years helping communities across the United States and Canada navigate the risks of building and living in wildfire-prone areas.
Developed FEMA's first course on planning in the wildland-urban interface and literally wrote the book on it for the American Planning Association. Her work sits right at the intersection of policy, planning, and the real-world decisions that shape community resilience. Welcome to the show, Molly. I'll jump right in and talk about some of the things that we're seeing in the news. There's just a lot of wildfires with California earlier the year. We're seeing things come up in Florida as they enter their wildfire season. And Molly, I just wanted to get your take on, are there really more fires? Are they more devastating than normal? And what's going on that's causing some of the things that we're seeing in the news?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. Well, it's I think a two-part answer. On the one hand, there are certainly more of these extreme events that are very attention-grabbing across the country, across the world, really. This isn't limited to the US, but there have always been fires. And so, we can go back to, as early as you can keep going back for a long time, but I'll just go back about 100 years. We started seeing some wildland-urban interface fires in California. Let's fast forward to the 1960s. More fires, particularly in California. You could find evidence of fires affecting communities really all over the country where there was and has been development. So on the one hand, it's not entirely new as a problem, but it's certainly gaining momentum. These what we'd call low probability, high consequence wildfires, especially in the past decade, are very troubling. And I think it's starting to also reframe some of the ways we think about who's at risk for wildfire and what should they do about it.
And Molly, can I ask for our audience, I had never heard that term wildland-urban interface up until I started preparing for this episode. And so we'll probably use the acronym WUI, but can you define that for our audience? What does that actually mean?
Sure. And I will. So we call it the WUI. I will say I don't love the term WUI, wildland-urban interface. It's very clunky. It does date back to, I think, the 70s. There was a physicist out of Stanford, if you want some, minor trivia. They started looking at these fires, particularly in Southern California, and kind of going, wow, what is this area where a wildland vegetation meets development? And so that was the original impetus for understanding this concept of the WUI. Traditionally, the WUI term, wildland urban interface, evolved fairly closely to there's these areas that are on the outskirts of a community where they tend to burn because a wildland fire will start. It'll threaten the community, and there's trees or brush of some sort that's intermixed around these homes. And so you had this visual of rural or like suburban areas that would burn in the WUI. And it was kind of this for several decades, just this concept of it happened out there in these forested places or these vegetated places. But really, I would say it's important to think of how much the term has evolved. We now see, of course, fires that have been affecting areas that are much more urbanized. And, you have examples all across the country where you'd say, wow, we didn't know embers could go this far into a developed area. So as our understanding of the WUI has evolved, we think more now of it conceptually as potentially any developed area where there are conditions that can allow for the ignition and spread of wildfire through this combined fuel complex. I know that's a little wonky, but think about where there's wildland fuels like vegetation, shrubs, even landscaping, and where are there these, quote, built fuels, homes, parts of homes that are combustible, like decks or other attachments, other structures, vehicles, equipment, really anything that is human made that's combustible. So you have built fuels, wildland fuels together in this combination. And so the WUI isn't necessarily this fixed place that's going to be static over time. As we make different development decisions, we can say, wow, this now is turning into a wildland urban interface situation that we need to plan for. So I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's important to know that the WUI is actually a fairly complex concept. But of course, we can spatially define it. There's ways people have done that. There are different maps of where the WUI is to help us just characterize where's human development in relation to wildland vegetation. And so those maps help us direct decisions like where should we apply regulations and what sort of trends do we see over time in terms of does the WUI grow, or has it expanded in certain areas?
Yeah, I'll just say before researching this episode, I did not realize how important wind was to that spread component. I understood the fuel component, but it seems like wind is one of the larger contributors to spread, and that can actually make it very challenging to determine where these things spread. Maybe that leads into this next question. What's the biggest misconception about wildfire risk that you hear from planners or insurers? Is it typically related to that spread component, or is it the fuel component? Any thoughts?
Gosh, I think wind is an interesting topic. I will say I am definitely not a risk modeler, but I know wind plays a huge component in these discussions of, putting wildfire risk models together. One of the bigger misconceptions I see come up time and time again, though, is just it's so basic. People look at a map, let's say where they're looking at whether it's a wildfire hazard map or a wildfire risk map, they tend to have these different colors of, some categorization of brown, yellow, gray. Gray's unburnable, yellow's usually moderate or low hazard, all the way up to a dark red, which would be the extreme hazard. We'll talk about hazard. A lot of people will look at that map and make assumptions like, well, I'm only yellow, so fortunately, I don't have to do much because I'm not as bad as this dark red over here, right? And so I think in some communities that's definitely changing with more education, but there is this pitfall of using maps almost too literally to say, well, thankfully I'm not that bad compared to everyone else, so I don't have to do as much in order to, be worried about the wildfire problem in my area. So that's definitely one we see as a misconception. And then the other one goes back to that idea of where is the WUI? And, we've seen a lot of cases recently, the Marshall Fire in Colorado, the Eaton Fire in Altadena, LA County are just two examples where places that burned were outside of what may have been the WUI in some cases, or a wildfire hazard area that was of concern. And so, the communities are saying, well, why did we burn when we were outside of the map? And so these maps are really useful, but they sometimes offer almost a false sense of security of, well, I'm either outside of the map or I don't have to worry because I'm not that bad on the map. And so we can use the map to our advantage, but we also have to know that the map is really a guiding tool as opposed to the end all be all for, ways to think about wildfire.
The next question we were going to ask, are we underestimating how the planning decisions we make today are going to shape wildfire outcomes 10 years from now? And it sounds like definitely. Didn't know if you had any specific examples that come to mind of where that may have happened or things we can be doing to mitigate that.
Yeah, I think we have been maybe not underestimating how pervasive wildfire hazard is, but not quite looking at how susceptible our development is to wildfire. We've relied on a model for a long time, which has generally been quite successful, of having a very advanced fire response and suppression system and infrastructure. And for many fires, that's very effective, but we're starting to see more fires where there simply are not enough resources to respond, especially when it moves into more suburban and urban environments. When I'm sure you've seen many powerful visuals where you'll have, tens or hundreds or sometimes thousands of homes on fire at the same time. And there's just simply not enough resources for any, highly functional suppression fire response to effectively put out those fires. So we have to start thinking about what else can we do to, one, increase public safety, increase first responder safety, give firefighters a chance to really control the fire to the extent they're able, and also have homes survive potentially on their own without any resources. So, we've been learning a lot over the past couple decades with where those are, where there have been some successes. What makes homes survive a wildfire? We've known for a while that things you do in and around the house are really helpful, but we're seeing where that's more important at a lot parcel level, but also we're starting to think about, well, what are the community-wide conditions that may play a role in how fire moves through a community?
Can you talk a little bit about your work for FEMA? You did the first WUI planning course, and just how did your work with them and the APA influence some national guidance on WUI?
Yeah, we created it was a while ago now, maybe I want to say 10 years. My colleague Kelly Johnston and I created the first FEMA guidance on wildland-urban interface plans and regulations. And I know that was part of their training curriculum for a number of years. More recently, and for the past 5 years, we've worked really closely with CAL FIRE to develop trainings that we've been doing. We've done at least 20 trainings around the state over the past few years now, where we bring fire officials and planners, building officials, and really anyone else engaged in development decisions together for a full day. These are free trainings, grant funded, and we talk about, what do you need to know about the wildland-urban interface? What are the California state requirements that planners have to know and have to do, as well as what are some of the best practices? So how do you go, above and beyond the minimum requirements? Prior to that, Kelly and I and a few other authors also did write the Planning the Wildland-Urban Interface guidance for the American Planning Association. And, it's funny, if you ever write something, especially with other colleagues that have their area of expertise, one of the most surprising things is I find myself repeatedly going back to that planning advisory services report that we wrote and going, yeah, what did we say about this? That was a good idea. So it's kind of become my own reference too over the past 5 years, as well as we've heard a lot of great feedback on just planners that want to understand these concepts better, it's really a go-to guide for them. And it's free. So if any of your listeners are interested in this, anyone can go to the American Planning Association, look for Planning the Wildland Urban Interface.
Double click a little into that and just give us a taste of like, what does it mean to do good planning?
Yeah, the default, I'll hear a lot of people say, and this might go back to one of your questions about what are these misconceptions. A lot of people say, well, why do we even build there? Why can't we just not build in some of these wildfire prone or wildfire hazard areas? And I wish it were that simple, but when you look at a map of where wildfire can occur around the entire country, you'll see there's a lot of wildfire hazard. A lot of things can burn across the US. So then the question becomes, well, where would we pick not to build? There certainly may be and are some places where we tend to think about, okay, it's a steep, narrow canyon, one way in, one way out. It's really setting up a community for significant risk if a wildfire is to occur. So there's that scenario. What's often more typical is, okay, we know there's some level of hazard here. What can we do to ensure that the homes that are going to get built or that are there can reduce their risk? So we have a lot of tools. It kind of depends. Is the community already there? Or is this a new community? If it's a new community, new development, there are many more tools that can be easily applied. If it's a subdivision, you can have subdivision regulations that say, well, how many points of access do we want? We want to make sure we have at least one way in and a secondary emergency access out. And this is for both the residents that live there, but also for first responders. We want to make sure there's adequate water supply. So, I've seen a lot of places that build without any water supply, no hydrant systems. If you aren't going to have water supply for fire, what will you have? There are some options, but certainly that needs to be a consideration. The homes themselves, what are their minimum requirements? There should be for ignition resistant materials, the type of landscaping that's allowed or not around a home. So you can start looking at, community wide or neighborhood wide, as well as ordinances for landscaping or building code requirements for the structures themselves. Existing development is harder, especially where you have limited things you can do. The road is only so wide and you can't always expand it, or it's very expensive to do that. So that's where we start looking at, are there some opportunities for retrofits? Maybe it's more at that parcel scale. A lot of things we're seeing, like removing flammable vegetation or mulch, looking at combustible fences. It sounds minor, but a lot of fires show these pathways of how fire moves through a community, and combustible things like fences, wooden fences, are actually a really big deal. So we start to look at, well, where can homeowners maybe more voluntarily make decisions as they make improvements? Maybe there's some also opportunities for vegetation along the roadways and reducing hazardous vegetation, so you can't make the road bigger, but you can make it safer. So there are a lot of things communities can do. It depends on what their starting point is in many cases.
So we have a lot of data scientists, actuaries who work with a lot of data, and I'm sure they'd be interested in what kind of data do communities actually have about WUI zones and what are they missing?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. There's so much data. It really depends on which community you're working with. We have now it's a blessing and a curse, and I would say an abundance of data and maps. There's maps at the national level. There are maps. Many states have maps related to wildfire hazard or risk, and then a lot of local communities have developed their own maps. And so for a long time, data has focused on advancements in like early wildfire detection, advancements in the level of granularity with fuel models, parcel level data. One of the things we haven't had as much information on is at the community level, but that's changing. I actually had a really interesting and exciting conversation with, his name is Dr. Hussam Mahmood out of Colorado State University, and his lab has been pioneering this model in terms of how to predict which buildings might survive in a wildfire. And it's based on this a network model, which was adopted from a disease transmission theory. I think what's most relevant for here is that model really simplifies how much, I guess you'd call it, computational processing is required, because traditionally we've had these great models, but they're so energy, like computer intensive, that it can be hard to run scenarios for more than a very small area of a community. So we're also seeing UC Berkeley as I think they've developed a similar model. Like, how do wildfires propagate through a community? And this is helpful because it starts to point to, if we can understand how the wildfire moves through the community, not just embers land on a parcel, what does that parcel look like, but what does the big picture look like? We can hopefully start to inform, well, where should we put our efforts? And one of the things that Dr. Mahmood's lab has been finding with their model is there is a combination of looking at vegetation and home hardening where you can be really strategic with potentially getting, I'll just say, the most bang for your buck without every single parcel in a community having to spend the resources on hardening their home, upgrading all of their home materials or cutting all the vegetation. In a perfect world, maybe we could argue everyone should do that. But in a real world, I think the most exciting advances are, where can we start to apply these models so we have, when we know resources are constrained, we can make the right investments in the best areas. And it means we may not have to do 100% everywhere, because usually that's not even the, is any community 100% successful with all of their mitigation all of the time? So I think, to me, that's exciting. That's exciting work right now.
Yeah, Molly, that's super interesting. And what's great about that is because we kind of asked, like, what is the data? How's it being used? But you also said the gaps and like the things that are coming next. A particularly challenging problem for us in our industry because we tend to make the math work and not be prone to those combinatorial problems. We tend to assume that risks are independent. And with this particular phenomena, that's certainly not the case, right? These things are interlinked. And it makes me wonder, are there any other gaps that you can think of or any other innovations like those that you just described that are kind of like coming up next so we're aware of them and we can start to think about how it would integrate with our math?
Some of the challenges that I'm also aware of or have heard from others is there have been a lot of advancements in parcel level data collection, but it's very inconsistent. One jurisdiction may have a great program over here where they have 10 trained assessors going out, going to individual properties, collecting a comprehensive amount of information on all of the vulnerabilities around a particular home and property. And then the neighboring jurisdiction may not have any of those resources or information. And so when you try to start piecing together a larger picture of wildfire across an entire county or even multiple counties, you will have inconsistent inputs, right? And so I think what would be helpful too, maybe going back to these community-wide or these larger modeling efforts, is how can we start to see the big picture that, one, in a perfect world, we'd have all this parcel data, but if we don't necessarily have all that data, can we still make strategic decisions? So that would be one thing that I think, with the emergence of parcel level data collection systems, I don't know if we'll ever standardize it, but it may be at a minimum getting the same amount of minimum information to use to compare apples to apples, as opposed to apples to maybe a hybrid of another fruit. The other challenge, I think, it goes back to something that you were just kind of asking about, Max, as well. So if you have all of this information, do people necessarily act on it, right? So would it have made a difference if people in Altadena knew that their risk, according to one map over here, that their risk was actually quite higher to wildfire? It's easy to look back on the fire and say, well, this map over here showed there was a really high risk. But does that mean there would have been a different outcome? So we also have to bring in the social science behind how do you change people's behavior, even when we have a lot of data to inform what we think would be a rational decision, right?
So this, if we can dig in a little onto that one, this might be a spicy question. Insurers tend to kind of have this negative perception, like they're very greedy and they're not writing in certain areas because they don't want to pay for the losses. And it feels on our end a little bit misunderstood for the reason that you actually described, is that we actually tend to think that if we can price risks appropriately, the proportionality of how likely it is to have a loss, and it's a fairer product for everyone at part of it, but it also sends price signals about the risk and it can influence the behavior. Because just like you said, just because if you tell someone it's riskier, it's a little bit different than actually getting that true insurance cost that reflects the risk. I'm curious, it's a bit open-ended, but do you have any thoughts on that? And, feel free to even push back on the role of the insurer and how I framed it.
Hmm. No, I don't disagree at all. The question of, well, have we been adequately pricing risk? I think the challenge, and you're probably more well aware of this than I am, is how do you catch up to what might be the appropriate price for that risk if traditionally it hasn't been, people aren't used to seeing their premium as high. And they bought the home under the assumption of, well, I can afford to live here because A, I can afford my mortgage, and B, I can afford the insurance. It's a really good question. And I know states have, I think anyway, that states have different approaches to how much the policy premiums can increase in some cases. So how long will it take to catch up to the true price or the true cost of living in an area? I don't know, but I do wish, and I don't know who would be able to solve this challenge, but I do wish there was a better alignment between what the risk is and what people can do about it. So one of the things we know with wildfire is you can, in some cases, change the risk, right? You can do things to make your home, or as we talked about, the community, you can reduce the risk. And I don't think anyone's saying you can make it 0%, but you can certainly do things that will reduce the likelihood of embers igniting vegetation around your home, for example. My perfect world wish would be, do we have a better system to align the measurement of risk in an area with actions that homeowners and community decision makers could take to then positively influence, well, could they get more of a premium reduction or confidence that they would get continued coverage, right? And so I think that's where the challenge is, of there's been a little bit of a, I don't know if I'd call it a black box, but just not knowing, well, I did this mitigation, but now I'm still getting dropped. What can I do? Right. And I'm not trying to say that's the fault of anyone. It's just more, I guess, more of an opportunity is, well, can we create a system that has these positive feedback loops where actions made a difference or are making a difference? And maybe of other models with other hazards where that is applied, but that would be, I think, something in my dream world we would have more of a functioning system on.
No, I totally agree. And I think that's a very amicable thing that we as a industry can be working towards. So really appreciate you saying that.
I have some questions about local governments. Are you seeing a role for them and any opportunities for policy innovation?
Yes. Oh, so much. That's also another good question. Local government is huge in this. I just finished researching, or I got to talked to 3 different communities that were affected by fires in Maui County, here in Colorado, where I'm based, after the Marshall Fire, and then LA County. And I talked mostly to planners, but a lot of it was on the recovery work that they were doing. And, in all of these cases, communities are usually thrust into this role that they didn't ask for. No one wants this, but, there's a number of people stepping up to the role of, wow, we had this devastating fire, now we need to do something about it. In an ideal world, we would have all of these things happening before a fire. More often than not, we see heavy engagement occurring once there is a fire and afterwards, and it's a huge wake-up call, right, for people saying, oh my gosh, we need to do something now. So what we do see with local governments are, what are we going to do? What does not just recovery look like, but long-term, what's our vision of being more, resilient to wildfire, reducing our risk so this doesn't happen again? In terms of what's innovative, it really runs the gamut of, maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be innovative, but it's effective. So, for example, in Maui County, they put together a long-term recovery plan that's just such a great pathway for setting them up for, as funding becomes available for recovery, they can slot this funding into short-term, mid-term, or long-term priorities. And they have this roadmap, which frankly could be, for the next few decades of development and recovery. I was also surprised when I talked to some of these planners that some of them used the opportunity of the post-fire recovery environment to buy out some parcels, and this, we often think of land buyouts as somewhat controversial, but in this case, they took the opportunity to say, hey, we've had our eyes on this area for a while. It's been prone to floods, it's now fire. And so I don't know all the mechanics of how they came up with the funding, but I do know, to me, that was an interesting, innovative step to say, well, let's buy this out and, manage it now as open space or whatever way was appropriate. So that's kind of a minor example, but I think one that's intriguing because I suspect we may see more of that in the future. Some of the mundane is more like, do you have an ordinance in place for recovering from wildfire in an efficient way and not having to kind of go into a mode of, wow, we just had this emergency, where do we start? So any community, any local government that can think beforehand, what are you going to do if you have a disaster, is already well ahead of the process.
Yeah, what could you tell us about effective mitigation? What does that look like from the planning lens, and how is that maybe different from how an insurer would define it?
One of the most, I would say, challenging things about our work is when you are really successful, you don't always know. So if we have all of the right things in place, we have great water supply, road specifications, homes, etc. But if a fire never threatens the area, you just have to say, well, these were all good things we should have done, because we know these are good. So we have to look at examples of, well, where were fires tested in a community where there were successful outcomes? There are some in Southern California. In fact, the LA Times did this great write-up of this example. Going to say it was, oh gosh, I might mix the name up, but it was definitely in the county of Orange. And I want to say Irvine or maybe Orchard Hills. It was a master planned community. Where were they built with these fire safe requirements? Some of them were like, there's a setback from the distance of the vegetation on the perimeter of the community. It's called a fuel modification zone, and that's sort of a buffer around the entire community. There was also, in this case, it was historically an avocado orchards. And so they did some more spacing with the avocado orchards and had some irrigation in place. All of their roads and their access met these minimum requirements. The parcels, the lots themselves, and the structures, the homes, were also meeting, minimum building code requirements. And in some cases, they were above and beyond. So you had the whole picture of, from the house to the lot to the neighborhood to the perimeter of the neighborhood, all of these pieces in place. and there was a fire that threatened this community, and it did exactly what they had hoped. It wasn't that there weren't fire suppression resources. It was more that there was a safe response. The fire behavior changed based on how they had managed the vegetation. It was safer to get the community out. And it was not just, 100 people. I want to say it was several, maybe tens of thousands of people that had to get out safely. They all did. First responders could access the area where they needed to. So those are the examples I really like to look at and say, hey, this was the holistic approach. It worked together. We know not every place can look like Southern California, but it points to where there were certain features in place that lended themselves to successful evacuation, successful response, successful mitigation where you didn't have homes burning uncontrollably. And we do see that in other cases. That's just one example where I think we like to say, well, this is how it all worked together.
Molly, you're a bit of a mind reader because you've consistently been anticipating our questions as we go through this. And one of the things I wanted to ask you next was about how do you measure the differences? And it sounds like that you've answered that exactly, because seems challenging, as you mentioned, because there's not a counterfactual, but it does seem like when we can look at examples, there is something that we can learn from that. And so this leads into maybe another spicy question, but in your work with FEMA, FEMA's just perpetually, it seems like it's underfunded, and the current administration has some big plans for FEMA, and we've kind of heard that maybe kicking the funding back to the states. I wonder what you think about maybe the investment that usually goes into response to an incident as opposed to going into a resilient development. So does that actually, the calculus of the cost, do you think that's the right way to do it, or just any thoughts on the topic more generally?
Yeah, and I don't work directly with FEMA anymore. I certainly interface with them, but we do work more with the Forest Service. So as a federal agency, we've been seeing some of the changes to what's been happening with their funding and resources. So it's similar because they make a lot of investments in mitigation as well. And I think we all know the statistic or a variation on the statistic of, $1 investment in mitigation is what the $4. So I've heard $6 payoff. So there's this idea that, if we put this upfront investment in before the fire or whatever other disaster occurs, it pays off multifold. And I agree. Again, it goes back to your point, Max. We don't always know how to measure that if there was never an event that tested it. So one of the emerging, I don't know if I'd say arguments for mitigation, but opportunities for more mitigation as well. Are there ways we can start combining concerns about fire safety and, let's say, energy efficiency or extreme heat planning or water efficiency, and where we have maybe multiple things going on? It's sad we have to make such a case for mitigation when we know it works, but are there ways we can make a stronger argument? As far as changes to the federal level of funding and potentially changing to the states, I think it's a little too soon to really know how that's going to play out. I've certainly heard opinions from colleagues who are more embedded in the in the federal level what their thoughts are, but it still feels a bit preliminary to know. I should say that if funds are being taken away, like the investments in some of the traditional programs that we've had for a while for mitigation, if those funds are going away, what will take its place? It will certainly be a huge deal if the BRIC program, for example, is gone and there is just no other program for it. The other thing I heard loud and clear from the communities I recently interviewed was how much FEMA was such a huge asset in their recovery process. Part of it is a lot of these people on the ground just don't have the expertise. They don't know necessarily all the steps in recovery unless, unfortunately, you've been through it before. But we're going to see more communities that are going to have fire at a terrible scale. And so the question is, who fills that void to give them technical expertise on recovery? I would hope we don't lose all of the knowledge that we've had through FEMA. I know certainly no system is perfect, and there's you could argue lots of flaws, I'm sure, but we do know that those agencies have played an incredible role with the level of knowledge they've been able to bring to disasters.
I have a question and a new topic, kind of shifting into innovation and mitigation through different tools or partnerships. Is there an example of an initiative or two you can give where you really saw some success in bridging sectors and having a good partnership?
Yeah, back in, oh gosh, 2014 or 15 maybe, so more than 10 years ago, some of our work has been in Eagle County, Colorado, and with the Vail Board of Realtors. And so I won't go into all the details of the history, but essentially the state at the time was looking at legislation that would have changed the way that some things are regulated. And I think the realtors were became very engaged in wildfire and said, wait a second, we don't know if we want this requirement to maybe influence real estate transactions in a way that would, I think, remove us from the conversation. So there's a lot more history and detail to that. But what it did was it prompted us to work closely with Eagle County. And we looked at the success of what Boulder County, Colorado was doing with their Wildfire Partners program at the time. And going back to this parcel level approach of saying if homeowners can do something at the parcel level through a professional assessment, they get all the right information about how to change vulnerabilities on their home or on their property, their landscaping. Then there was at the end of that in Boulder County a carrot. And one of the carrots was they actually were seeing reductions in insurance or the assurance that they would continue getting coverage. And so we mirrored that program in Eagle County, and it's called Real Fire. And Real Fire is the realtor part of the engagement. And the Vail Board of Realtors has just been tremendously a huge partner in coming to the table every year. They do trainings for their realtors to help them learn about insurance and wildfire mitigation and the Real Fire program. And there's a number of things Eagle County is doing in addition to Real Fire, but that's one of their main ways that they engage with homeowners. And I think with any of these parcel level assessment programs, when they're well done, they are a measurable way to show risk reduction. So it goes back to that feedback loop we were talking about is can you come up with a system where you may have all these parcels, let's just say they're red on the map when you come up with their initial risk, but when you give them a list of things that they can do, homeowners, and they do it, you can see that change over time. So it's really encouraging. And, I just would give a big shout out to my colleague, Kelly Johnston. He really spearheaded a lot of that work with Eagle County and the Vail Board of Realtors have just been a huge support. The link to the insurance pieces, often when we have done these annual trainings for realtors, they're tremendously interested in the insurance piece. And then so they're also educating themselves on, well, what do we need to know to give confidence to get these homes insured? Because of course, that's a big part of the real estate transaction process. One of the topics that I think we have seen repeatedly, and I've struggled to see, who's quote responsible for this, where does the responsibility really fall? Is it the homeowner? Is it the insurer? Is it someone else? I don't know if it's so much the planner, but we see it. We all are living with the consequences of underinsurance. And it's interesting because back in 2011, maybe when the Waldo Canyon fire happened, one of the big impressions that I had, the lasting impressions from that fire, was we started to hear about underinsurance and how many constraints that puts on rebuilding back to normal, rebuilding in the recovery process. And so that was when I first really learned about it. And I think fast forward, let's say to the Marshall Fire in 2021, so about 10 years later, it was disheartening to hear how many people were underinsured. Now, granted, they may have said, well, we didn't know we had a wildfire problem, so we didn't think about this type of insurance level for rebuilding. But we consistently see that everywhere. And I've wondered, what's the right entry point to educating people more? I think there is growing awareness on the gap between underinsurance and insurance that would allow you to fully rebuild and recover without additional financial resources. I think about that a lot with the planning world, the community planning piece as well. How can we maybe make better linkages between, are there opportunities to make linkages between insurance and planning?
Yeah, I mean, I'll peel back the curtain a little bit for you because I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Is that historically agents had helped quite a bit to kind of like determine the amount of insurance that someone needed and explain the trade-offs of getting more or less coverage. These days, it's generally coming from like a model, right? So a model is producing some sort of estimate, and two insurers could have a very different estimate. And even then, the agent is supposed to play a role, but purely due to cost, agents are getting squeezed out more and more and more, and it's becoming purely algorithmic. The problem is twofold, where you don't have like an agent who can say, hey, you have custom cabinets that's going to cost a little bit more. We should add a little bit more coverage. And we also don't have someone explaining the risk of that type of loss and the propensity for being underinsured. So it's certainly a challenge to kind of like everyone stay competitive and, afloat, but keep this communication. So I'm curious if you just have any thoughts, like, as an outsider, what do you think that means for us based on how we're doing it?
No, I think it's really, I mean, I always love learning more about what is happening behind the scenes or behind the curtain with insurance, because it's almost the opposite, where I hear a lot of assumptions about planning. Like I said one earlier as well, why are planners even letting people build there? Well, it's not quite that simple. Another assumption is, well, why can't you change things when people build back? Well, as you probably know, because usually there's a zoning map that says you have to build back a certain way. And one of the things I've also learned from, more so from homeowners, but also insurers, is to say, well, your policy may dictate how you can or cannot rebuild, and with the time frame and what you have to do in order to get the full amount. So I think finding ways to learn more about each other's industries, planning, insurance, risk, is really an opportunity that I see, because I've heard also many assumptions in discussions about, like, well, it's the insurer that should do this, or the insurer, why isn't the insurance company doing that? And I think the more we learn about, well, usually there's constraints or there are reasons why the industry is operating a certain way, is really helpful.
Yeah, and I'll say even just on our end, talking to you, I'm learning so much as we go, and my mind is starting to see that there is potentially evolution for the role of the insurer that can be mutually beneficial. So I think this communication kind of moving back and forth is probably going
Mhm.
to be helpful in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, there's so many questions. I read a solutions paper not that long ago about what else we could think about to solve this disaster crisis. And one strategy was community based insurance programs, and it sounds good, but I wonder, is that really a viable option? Should we even be thinking about that? Was that written by someone that knows about it, or was that just a suggestion because it sounds like a good idea on paper? Because there's, many ideas that sound good on paper, but perhaps will never come to fruition.
Yeah, no, 100% agreed.
Do you have any advice on how to engage with the residents, the developers, or elected officials who are maybe skeptical or underinformed?
Hmm. I was just thinking about this yesterday because I was having a conversation with a developer who I'll be on a panel with in a few weeks and on wildfire resilience. And he said, a lot of people that he works with still really just, they want to know more about their kitchen or their light fixtures, or the price point was around not so much, oh, I'm getting wildfire mitigation as part of my property, or my new home is has meets these wildfire mitigation requirements, but more, there still seems to be a very popular segment, or a large segment of the population, that is really interested in, I want a bigger house, or how much value can I get for my house? And I want, to talk about these fixtures in the house. So I guess that's all to say, I was thinking about it. What are the drivers for why people should care? Our world is like, I live and breathe wildfire every day, and I forget about all of the other priorities that people have in life besides just wildfire. One of them is insurance, though. We are really seeing a lot of interest prompted by insurance, mostly in Western states, not just California, though. People are they're coming to their fire protection districts, they're going to their local government, they're going to the state government, they're going to their legislatures and saying, okay, I have an insurance problem now. How can you help me? And what can I do? Whether that's good or bad that they're doing that, at least there's the awareness is being raised. I think this is another argument why we see the need for regulations. A lot of communities we work with, especially local governments or decision makers for many years, have said, well, why don't we just educate people? And once they know about this, they'll take the steps on their own and they'll do what they need to do for wildfire mitigation. And we say, great, but that's not how it works. Some people they have time, they have the resources, they have the interest, but we think actually there's a role for regulation, and we're starting to see that in more states. Colorado, for one, right now is contemplating and will be passing a statewide minimum code. We've seen statewide minimum codes for a long time in California, also in Washington and Oregon. States are starting to take a leadership role in saying, okay, at a minimum, you need to build this way for most of them cases, new construction for your house and sometimes your community to meet these minimum requirements. In a perfect world, we'd all know about wildfire, we'd all do it on our own, and we wouldn't need regulations. But like I said, that's just unfortunately not what we're seeing everywhere. So I think those minimum regulations offer some consistency and almost as a backstop to the people that aren't taking the initiative or maybe need support, but at least it's more part of the process as opposed to just, we hope you do it if you can do it.
Yeah. No, I mean, this particularly seems like a complex issue. So it's, some expecting everyone to be an expert and knowing all these things seems unreasonable. And so it does seem like there's some role that could be, collective and cost effective. So that makes a lot of sense to me. So maybe we'll move to our lightning round. We'll just ask you a bunch of quick questions. And if you want to rapid fire responses, because we just have, we could talk to you forever. We're all learning quite a bit just in this short period of time. Is there a tool that you cannot live without for wildfire planning? Like the first thing that this is absolutely necessary.
I would love to have a lightning round answer to that. Let me think for a moment. This is so terrible in the sense that it sounds like I'm shamelessly plugging my report again. But if I have to be honest, I like I said, I go back to that report that I co-authored with several other experts. It's just kind of in my Bible. So part of that reason is because the chapters that my colleague Kelly Johnston authored on wildfire hazard and risk in the WUI, those are really helpful for me as a planner who lives in that world but is not myself a wildfire risk modeler or fire behavior analyst. So just having a go-to resource like that has been very invaluable. I'm sure there's others that people would have, but having kind of that desktop reference, I think, has been really good.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to link to that in our show notes. What's one term in wildfire planning you wish the insurer would better understand?
I think insurers understand, they truly understand risk. Probably the WUI, what it goes back to with the WUI and where's the WUI, where's not the WUI. Again, though, I don't fault insurers for that. Many people don't really know what the WUI is, or thinking that the WUI is kind of constrained to one certain area and not thinking outside the box, no pun intended.
And can you complete this sentence? In 5 years, wildfire mitigation will look like what?
Ooh, in 5 years, wildfire mitigation will look much more comprehensive, and many more benefits will be realized from those who participate in it.
Okay, and so right now you have the ear of tons of people in insurance, right? Underwriters, actuaries, data scientists. What's one policy change or shift in approach you wish they'd champion tomorrow? Is it the underinsurance component, or is there something else just in terms of underwriting? You've got our ear, Molly. We're listening. President Molly Mowery.
There's a lot of pressure on this question because this is so good. I would say, again, looking for the opportunities to incentivize, because I think people want to do this. People want to mitigate their properties, their risk, and communities want to mitigate themselves, what else can they do to have that positive feedback loop in place? Because I know it goes back to what we talked about earlier in the conversation. But, what other ways, what other incentives are available for residents and policymakers in the planning world to engage in wildfire mitigation that can link to insurance more directly?
Is there one community you've worked with that gives you hope?
Yes, we're working with Jefferson County, Colorado right now. They're one of many, but they did a great update to their WUI map through a separate nonprofit, the Ember Alliance, they worked with, and we worked with the Ember Alliance. They have a very sophisticated approach to their WUI now. They really understand the different types of WUI that they should plan for, and they're looking at updating their wildfire regulations. And I think they've looked at neighboring counties and said, we don't want that disaster. So they're being proactive and they're taking it on and to say, well, what can we do before hopefully that level of disaster affects us?
Well, Molly, that sounds like the perfect place to end it. Insurers are going to rush to give that county a discount. Do you have any parting thoughts or any place where our audience can find out more about you and see your material?
Yes. Well, my parting thoughts are thank you so much. This was wonderful. And again, I know you said you've been learning from me, but I always learn as well from folks in the insurance professionals. So to the extent we can continue the dialogue, it's just welcome on any level. But we have a lot of resources at communitywildfire.org, our nonprofit, the Community Wildfire Planning Center. So many of the resources I mentioned today are available there. That's a great place to go for more information. And you can, of course, get in touch with us that way too.
Thank you, Molly.
Thank you both. That was wonderful. I really appreciated the opportunity.
So, Alicia, that was a very interesting conversation. Any immediate thoughts?
There are so many aspects to this, and I'm wondering what's most relevant to our listeners. Like, what should they be thinking about differently than before they heard this episode? I mean, she gave some great examples, but wondered if anything jumped out with your perspective as a data scientist.
I mean, a lot. I'm learning how much I didn't know about this. And even in the preparation for this episode, going through that presentation from Milliman at RPM, I didn't know how impactful wind was into the WUI. Because, I mean, it sounds like it just causes the WUI to be much larger than you'd otherwise think. And what's interesting is, in pricing in particular, we typically price out different perils, right? Your risk for a lightning loss, your risk for a wind loss. And it's not so much that there's an assumption of independence between these things, but like when our claims department gets a fire claim, but the fire department sprayed a bunch of water to put out the fire, and there's these, water related losses, we're still going to tie that back to fire because that's the cause of risk. And so here it was kind of interesting to think about. There's like the vegetation to vegetation, or the structure to structure, or the vegetation to structure, and wind is pushing the fire for some instances, and it seems a little bit more complex than we'd like to think it is. So the complexity is very challenging to parse back, and it was good to have this conversation because we learned quite a bit more. I also thought, Molly was, I think, very diplomatic and respectful in how she talked about the role of the insurer. I don't want to read too deeply into it because she didn't say it specifically, but I think if I was being, self-critical of our industry, because I do see a lot of criticism of insurance that I simply just don't agree with, but I think she brought up some really valid points about, just more transparency on like why someone can not get insurance. What could they do to resolve those things? And then who's responsible for underinsurance, right? These are tangible things that I think a reasonable person can say, the insurer can play a role in addressing those things. So my mind is kind of racing, and these are the types of conversations that made me say, dang, I wish I was back at a carrier because there's so much research and enhancement that could be done. And so I have to live vicariously through our audience and hope that they can do it. But yeah, I thought it was a really great conversation. I hope to reconnect with her in the future and see if we can have deeper conversations as well.
When you mentioned the Milliman presentation, that reminded me also reading that and seeing what they pulled from the CAL FIRE report, where there's a disconnect between the three parties. There's the people exposed to the risk, those who understand the risk, and those in the position to take action to reduce the risk. And right now they're just they're not connected. So we have a lot of opportunities to improve things that benefit all three of those groups.
Yeah, I mean, it feels a lot like insurance too, where insurance is so compartmentalized. And we even had this in prior conversations where it feels like communication is not flowing. This actually feels like the commonality in terms of like natural disasters and catastrophic events is that information is just not flowing, and there's more to be done.
Yeah, definitely a theme now the past few episodes. So hopefully we can help bridge some of that as we continue to talk to these guests and get the information out there to our listeners. So any other parting thoughts?
Great conversation. I'm interested to see how this develops. Even if we just have Molly back in 5 years to see about her projection of what she thinks will happen.
Again, thank you to everyone who listened today. If you have recommendations for topics you'd like to hear or guests you'd like us to interview, just catch up with us on LinkedIn. Let us know your thoughts. We always want to hear from you. Join us on the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Casualty Actuarial Society, its subsidiaries, or the employers of the hosts and guests. This podcast may discuss topics related to insurance and regulatory issues, but the information shared should not be considered as legal or regulatory advice.